You know, there are moments in politics where entire stadiums roar, cameras flash, and world leaders puff up their chests like peacocks. And then, out of nowhere, one man, with one word, dismantles the entire performance. That's exactly what happened when Jaishankar calmly dropped a word so sharp, so precise, that it ripped through Trump's India narrative like a pin through a balloon. No shouting, no chest thumping, no circus, just pure, devastating clarity. The power of a single word in politics is often underestimated, yet history has shown that sometimes it is not lengthy speeches, sweeping reforms, or grand gestures that change the course of dialogue, but the carefully timed utterance of a single, precise word. In the case of Jaishankar, this was exactly what happened. He didn't need to raise his voice, deliver a fiery monologue, or indulge in theatrics. Instead, he used one word, delivered in his calm, collected and calculated manner, which managed to disarm the bluster that had surrounded Trump's version of India. It was not just the word itself, but the context in which it was spoken. It was spoken at a time when Trump's India narrative was filled with exaggerated claims, showmanship, and almost cinematic spectacle that presented the country as little more than a cheering backdrop to his personality. A stadium of 100,000 people shouting in unison was supposed to signify dominance, control, and validation. Yet with one word, Jaishankar reminded the world that India's voice is not a stage prop for anyone's global campaign trail. The brilliance of that single word lies in its surgical precision. It didn't insult, it didn't antagonize, it didn't even directly challenge Trump in a confrontational sense, but what it did was dismantle the illusion. Diplomacy often depends on language, and language depends on nuance, and Jaishankar is a master of that art. He knew that saying too much would invite unnecessary backlash, but saying just the right amount would shake the foundations of a false narrative. This is why it landed with such devastating impact. The world media latched onto it, not because it was loud, but because it was sharp. And in politics, sharpness cuts deeper than volume. The fact that one word could overshadow all the noise generated by Trump's approach speaks volumes about the weight of substance over spectacle. It showed that India under Jaishankar's watch was no longer playing a secondary role, no longer accepting definitions imposed from the outside, and no longer content with being an extra in someone else's performance. That word symbolized restraint and power simultaneously, a paradox that only effective diplomacy can achieve. It wasn't about sounding bigger, louder, or flashier. It was about asserting presence with precision, and in that moment, Jaishankar proved that one word, if chosen wisely, is sometimes all it takes to shatter an entire illusion. The clash of image versus reality was one of the most defining features of the Trump era when it came to India, because what the world saw on the surface and what was actually happening beneath were two very different stories. Trump's India was built around spectacles, stadium rallies, endless praise of personal relationships, and declarations that made it look like India was orbiting around his charisma. He portrayed the partnership as if it was entirely his achievement, as if the friendship existed because of his unique personality and deal-making flair. The Howdy Modi event, the giant crowd in Ahmedabad, the booming speeches, and the handshakes were all carefully curated images meant to signal power and dominance, a show that created headlines but didn't necessarily reflect the depth or the balance of the relationship. It was, in essence, a public performance, one where India was painted as the stage, the background, and the applause for an American president's campaign-style appearance. Jaishankar's single word exposed how fragile that performance really was. He sliced through the carefully constructed image and reminded everyone that diplomacy is not about optics, it is about reality. And the reality is that India is not an accessory to America's foreign policy theatrics. The clash was stark because on one side you had Trump's larger-than-life personality trying to define India through his own narrative, and on the other side you had Jaishankar's cool, unshakable voice bringing the focus back to substance. The moment he uttered that word, the carefully maintained illusion cracked, because suddenly the narrative shifted away from stadium lights and slogans to the raw fact that India defines itself, not by the image projected onto it, but by the reality it creates for itself. The power of that clash was that it put an end to the one-sided portrayal of India as dependent on external validation. For years, many nations looked at India through the prism of how it was represented by others, often the West, often powerful leaders who wanted to use India as a symbol in their own domestic campaigns. Trump's version of India was very much like that, a tool, a backdrop, a set piece for American showmanship. But Jaishankar's word made it clear that India cannot and will not be reduced to that. It was a collision between the glittering image and the hard substance, and substance won because while images fade, reality endures. India's assertion of identity in that moment was not just about diplomacy, it was about history, psychology, and the evolution of a nation that has often been framed by others rather than defining itself. For decades, India's image on the global stage was filtered through outside lenses, whether it was seen as a developing country in need of aid, a strategic pawn during the Cold War, or a marketplace waiting for Western investment. Even when celebrated, it was rarely on its own terms, and when criticized, it was often judged by metrics imposed from the outside. This created a lingering perception that India was reactive, always responding to others' narratives, instead of unapologetically setting its own. Jaishankar's one word changed that dynamic because it wasn't just an argument, it was a declaration of identity. It was India saying, in essence, we decide who we are, and no president, no superpower, no spectacle gets to dictate that. Trump's narrative of India was filled with grand images of loyalty and adoration, painting the country as an enthusiastic cheerleader to his leadership. But that was a projection, not reality. Jaishankar's word shattered that projection and replaced it with a reminder that India is not a supporting character in another leader's story, but the protagonist of its own. This assertion of identity marked a turning point because it signaled a new confidence, one that was rooted not in dependency or validation, but in sovereignty and self-respect. The power of that statement was that it was not angry, not loud, not defensive. It was calm, almost understated, and yet it carried the weight of centuries of struggle for independence and decades of effort to stand tall in the world. When a nation asserts its identity, it sends a signal far beyond the immediate political context. It tells its citizens that their country is no longer waiting for approval. It tells its allies that partnerships will be on equal terms, and it tells its critics that India has moved past the era of being defined by others. Jaishankar's word encapsulated that evolution perfectly, serving as a symbol of an India that is modern, confident, and unapologetic. It was a small word, but behind it was the force of a nation that has decided to no longer let its image be scripted by someone else's playbook, no matter how powerful that someone might be. Diplomacy as a psychological game has always been about more than the content of agreements or the fine print of treaties. It is about perception, posture, and the invisible contest of who controls the narrative in the room. Trump was a master of theatrics and dominance games, the kind of leader who used nicknames to belittle rivals, exaggerated handshakes to assert physical superiority, and constant self-praise to create an atmosphere where he appeared untouchable. His approach to India was no different. It was a page out of the same playbook where the friendship was cast as his personal achievement and the relationship was painted in terms that suggested India should be grateful for his attention. But psychological games only work when the other side accepts the framing, and Jaishankar's single word was a masterstroke that refused to play along. By choosing restraint over reaction, precision over provocation, and subtlety over spectacle, he turned the psychological tables without needing to shout or posture. What made the word so effective is that it landed in the exact way psychological counters are supposed to. Trump's dominant strategies relied on others either overreacting or folding, but Jaishankar did neither. Instead, he calmly dismantled the illusion, and in doing so, he forced Trump into an unfamiliar space where his usual tactics didn't work. The brilliance of psychological strategy in diplomacy is that silence, tone, and timing matter as much as the words themselves, and Jaishankar delivered his word with all three calibrated perfectly. It was not loud, but it echoed. It was not long, but it lingered. It was not aggressive, but it was unyielding. That is the mark of a seasoned diplomat who understands that sometimes the best way to win a psychological contest is not to escalate, but to puncture the balloon of performance with a single pin. This moment mattered because it showed that India was not just present at the table, but fully capable of matching psychological maneuvering with its own brand of quiet strength. The psychological dominance that Trump often projected worked with many leaders, but it faltered here because India's representative refused to be drawn into the theatre of ego. Instead, Jaishankar asserted control with the one thing Trump rarely encountered: measured resistance that couldn't be mocked, bullied, or brushed aside. The outcome was a silent checkmate, a reminder that diplomacy is not about who speaks the loudest, but who manages to control the psychological tempo of the encounter. The media shockwave that followed Jaishankar's word was almost as significant as the word itself, because in the world of modern politics, perception is often shaped less by what happens in a closed diplomatic room, and more by how it is reported, replayed, and amplified across global outlets. Trump had always been a magnet for media attention, feeding journalists with his dramatic statements, off-the-cuff remarks, and grand spectacles that guaranteed headlines. His relationship with India was presented in this same style, with pictures of massive crowds, glowing speeches, and declarations of unprecedented friendship filling the pages of newspapers and dominating television coverage. But when Jaishankar calmly dropped that one word, the media narrative shifted almost instantly. It was no longer about the size of Trump's rallies in India or his exaggerated claims of unity. It became about how India's foreign minister had surgically dismantled the illusion with a single carefully chosen expression. The global press thrives on contrasts, and the contrast between Trump's loud, flamboyant performance and Jaishankar's quiet, devastating precision was too powerful to ignore. Headlines highlighted how a single word had done what pages of policy analysis could not, cutting through the noise and reframing the entire conversation. Instead of Trump being the center of the story, suddenly it was India, asserting its own voice, refusing to be reduced to a backdrop. The media, which had long been conditioned to treat Trump's theatrics as the story itself, found in Jaishankar's intervention something even more compelling: the quiet triumph of substance over spectacle. That shift was a shockwave because it broke the pattern of coverage that had elevated Trump's version of events above all else. The impact of this media turn was twofold. Internationally, it showed the world that India was not playing along with a narrative that diminished its agency, and domestically, it sent a message to Indians that their leaders could stand firm without theatrics, using intelligence and restraint to command attention on the world stage. The fact that journalists across continents picked up the story demonstrated how fragile Trump's narrative actually was, because one word was enough to pull the rug out from under months of image building. Media thrives on drama, but in this case, the drama was not in Trump's usual showmanship, but in its unraveling, and Jaishankar's calm precision gave reporters a new angle that was both surprising and irresistible. The shockwave was proof that in politics, control of the media narrative is as important as control of the diplomatic table. And with that one word, India seized it. The symbol of a new India was embedded in that single word because it carried far more weight than just a diplomatic correction. It carried the essence of a nation that had transitioned from cautious self-presentation to unapologetic self-definition. For years, India's global image was that of a country rising but still needing acknowledgement, often framed as the world's largest democracy, yet one that sought validation from Western powers to cement its place. This created a dynamic where India was frequently described rather than declaring itself, judged in terms of economic potential or geopolitical utility rather than seen as a fully sovereign actor charting its own destiny. Jaishankar's word broke that mold because it encapsulated a new India, one that was not afraid to assert itself in the global conversation without the crutch of external approval. This was a generational shift in tone. The old India was careful, sometimes hesitant, navigating international politics with deference to stronger powers. The new India, as demonstrated in that moment, was confident, strategic, and unwilling to be cast as secondary. It was a symbol that the country had outgrown the phase of being spoken for and had entered the phase of speaking for itself. By choosing a single word rather than a long justification, Jaishankar signaled that India did not feel the need to explain or prove its identity anymore. It simply stated it, and that was enough. That simplicity was the symbol, a reminder that strength does not always need to be shouted. What resonated globally was that this one word shattered not only Trump's inflated portrayal of India, but also the lingering stereotype of India as a passive participant in international affairs. It was not just about rejecting a narrative, it was about replacing it with a stronger one, where India's voice was decisive, calm, and authoritative. For Indians themselves, it became a moment of pride because it reflected a country that was no longer waiting for its story to be told, but was determined to tell it on its own terms. This is why it felt like the symbol of a new era. India, through its foreign minister, was presenting itself as equal, as sovereign, as unapologetic. It was a declaration that the time of dependency on external images was over, and the era of India as an assertive global power had begun, all encapsulated in the power of a single, unforgettable word. And so, what we witnessed was not just a diplomatic correction, but a generational shift. One word exposed the emptiness of spectacle, reasserted India's sovereign identity, and proved that diplomacy is not about who shouts loudest, but about who speaks with the greatest precision. Trump's India may have been built on image, but Jaishankar's India was built on substance. That moment marked the arrival of a new India, confident, unapologetic, and unwilling to be anyone's backdrop. One word, and the illusion crumbled. One word, and the balance of power shifted. One word, and the world finally saw India as it truly is. Not a prop, not a pawn, but a player standing tall on its own terms.